2017. Throughout all of 2017, starting in January, and we were split up into 4 different subcommittees. We had data collection and scope, kind of looking at what is the issue in Frederick County, how big of an issue is it in Frederick County. Then we had community response and protocol, which was the subcommittee that I was on. We had training and education, and then legislative considerations. And then in the end of 2018, January 2018, we were provided an entire report to the county council regarding our findings. And there's going to be a lot on your screen, but I'm going to just go over it briefly of what the recommendations were. So one of the legislative recommendations was to establish a training program for lodging establishment employees. And so that bill did go into effect in December of 2018, and it requires annual certification of employee training. We have some bigger hotel names here in Frederick County, and we have some smaller hotels. So most of the larger hotels, I'm sure most of you know, already provide their own training to employees. And so they just have to provide us with verification that they have done that training. And then the smaller hotels, we refer them to other training options so that they can provide that certification as well. The next legislation that was passed was a county body works license. So it simply defines body works. It did not actually establish a license. That also went into effect December 2018. And then the last piece of legislation that was recommended that also passed was a bill to establish penalties for landlords and/or tenants who knowingly allow trafficking activities in their properties. And that also went into effect in December of 2018. And at the time of our task force, our current county executive, Jessica Fitzwater, was actually on the county council, and she sponsored these pieces of legislation. So we were thankful to her for that. The second recommendation was to provide staff support to assist with the implementation of all of our recommendations. This we have kind of worked in through multiple different positions. You'll see that there's multiple agencies that are a part of our response team. And so right now I have a victim witness coordinator who assists me with some of the staff support. We have partly House members who assist with some of the staff support. So we haven't actually created a full-time position for this, but we've kind of delegated it out to different members of the HTRT. The third recommendation was to follow what Howard County did in terms of creating a bill to establish a survivor services fund from assets seized from traffickers during investigations. So while we did not do that, we have created a victim services fund through our MOU from all of the partners. Our victim services fund is an account that we grow through fundraising. And basically the idea behind that was that we saw a need for funding for victims that may have been limited by other funding accounts. For example, we had a case where a trafficking victim had to travel from out of state. She wanted to bring a support person with her for that travel for the testimony for trial. And unfortunately, our MSAA victim account only covered funds for the victim and not for her support person. So we recognized that there was definitely a need, that there was a gap and being able to provide all of the services that we need to provide to victims. So we did create that fund through our MOU, and that has been active for several years now. The next recommendation was that the county executive post signage and information regarding the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline in county buildings on websites and social media. If you've been to any Frederick County buildings within the last 5 years, you will see that those signs are posted throughout our buildings. I work in the courthouse every day, and when I walk in the door, that's one of the first signs that I see. So that has been posted throughout county buildings. The fifth recommendation was the creation of a multidisciplinary response team. And this is how we established the HTRT. So we determined during our work through this fact-finding task force that we were making lots of connections. We were working very well collaboratively together, and we didn't want that to end. And we knew that we need to continue that work to best serve victims and survivors in our community. And so we created the HTRT immediately after the conclusion of the task force in February of 2018, and we have been established and continuing to work as a HTRT since that time. The sixth recommendation was to establish interagency protocols and create a memorandum of understanding to address confidentiality, adherence to best practices, and trauma-informed response to survivors of trafficking. As part of the HTRT, we did establish a county-wide protocol as well as a memorandum of understanding, and that was most recently updated as of January 1st last year. And our MOU was actually re-signed in August of last year as well. So we, and I'll talk a little bit further about that later, but we continue to update it and look to see if we need to make any changes from the initial protocol and MOU. The seventh recommendation was to adopt an assessment protocol to increase identification of survivors and utilize the resource guide to provide a community response to survivors. During the task force, we had worked on creating an assessment protocol. We kind of were basing it off of the domestic violence lethality screening. And so while we didn't adopt that direct assessment protocol, we do know that several agencies have their own. For example, DJS has their own assessment protocol for youth entering detention facilities. DSS has their own assessment protocol as well. And we've really worked on training EMTs, law enforcement, those individuals who may come into contact with a victim or survivor, to make sure that we're assessing individuals, to make sure that we're providing the best services that we can. We do have a resource guide. We are working on updating that. I think the last time it was updated was 2021. So we may be reaching out to some agencies to see if you'd like to be included on our resource guide as well. The eighth recommendation was to create standardized discipline-specific training and resources, particular human trafficking issues for agencies and organizations who may encounter survivors. And we have done that through our community outreach subcommittee within our human trafficking response team. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I delve into what we've been doing over the past several years. The ninth was to provide targeted awareness education to vulnerable populations through community outreach events and social media campaigns. And our community outreach subcommittee has also been working on this as well. 10th was to utilize the screening tool to assist with monitoring and reporting data within agencies. So again, this is going back to the prior recommendation where we had created a screening tool that was similar to the domestic violence lethality screening tool. While we did not adopt that exact tool, other agencies have used their screening tools. And 11 was to conduct an annual needs assessment survey of key stakeholders regarding human trafficking specific issues. And the idea behind that was to reach out to our community partners and see, you know, are you identifying victims and survivors? We know that they're out there. The question is, are they being identified? And we did that, I believe, in 2019. We're working on doing an updated one to see kind of the differences in responses. And hopefully we can do that this year. So the establishment of the HTRT, the state's attorney's office, my office, is the lead agency of the HTRT. Hartley House, which is our rape crisis center, who provides services to sexual assault victims, domestic violence victims, as well as human trafficking victims and child abuse victims. They are the co-chair of the HTRT, and we broke it down into 3 subcommittees: our steering subcommittee, our protocols, and our community outreach. And our mission is to provide a victim-centered collaborative response to human trafficking in Frederick County to assist in identification of victims, prosecution of cases, and the availability and use of comprehensive services to survivors. So our steering subcommittee, the reason that we wanted a steering subcommittee is that we wanted to ensure that our HTRT is continuing to move forward. So the purpose behind the steering subcommittee was to pull the leaders of the protocol subcommittee and the community outreach subcommittee and say, this is where we're at, this is where we're going, and then have we met our goals, to continue to make sure that we're constantly evaluating the progress and the process that we're making, and we're continuing to make an impact in our community. So the members of the steering committee are myself, Jessica Beal, who is our CPS supervisor, and Jennifer Collins, who is our regional navigator, who works with Hartley House. Our protocols subcommittee, the mission statement for the protocols subcommittee is that we strive to ensure a collaborative, victim-centered approach to the identification of and response to incidents of human trafficking in Frederick County by creating a countywide protocol, and seeks to understand human trafficking victimization and service needs through data collection and analysis. So our protocols subcommittee is comprised of my office, local and federal law enforcement, our local hospital, victim advocates, the Department of Social Services, the Department of Juvenile Services, and our Child Advocacy Center. And what we've done is we created a multidisciplinary countywide protocol. And the next slide, I will show you kind of a screenshot of it. You're not going to be able to read much, but if anyone is interested in seeing our protocol or our MOU, I'm happy to share that. I know that I have shared them with other jurisdictions already. So if anyone would like to see that, please feel free to reach out. By all means, not perfect, I'm sure, but it's also a good starting point. We also effectuated an MOU between all of the participating agencies to address confidentiality concerns, as I'm sure anyone who works in this field knows that each different agency has their own confidentiality. CPS has different confidentiality than Hartley House, who has grant funds. So we wanted to create an MOU to address all of those concerns. And then also it created the Victim Services Fund. We also hold ad hoc MDT meetings for case review. If anyone here is on a child abuse MDT team, it's very similar to that. So when a victim or a high-risk victim is identified, we all gather together and we get all of the agencies who are involved together in a quick little Zoom meeting. Thank you, COVID, to making it so we can all join via Zoom, makes it a little easier, just to discuss where we're at. Where is law enforcement in the case? Where is CPS? Where's our regional navigator? You know, sharing information so that we can ensure that we're providing the best services and the most comprehensive services to that identified victim. And we have been doing that for several years now, and it really helps with the flow of communication to ensure that we all are aware of what the other agencies know. Moving forward, we're looking at potentially creating a proactive joint task force with our cyber crimes task force. So Frederick County also has a cyber crimes task force that is a proactive task force, and they handle all cyber crime cases. So we'll be looking into that a little bit more since we have created our protocol and our MOU. And here's just a screenshot of the first page of our protocol. You can see the partners at the top: the Frederick Police Department, the Sheriff's Office, Homeland Security, FBI, DSS, the hospital, Maryland State Police, CAC, DJS, and Hartley House. And the purpose was to establish uniform procedures for the identification of and response to identified human trafficking victims, to assist in connecting the victim to resources, as well as successful prosecution of human trafficking cases in Frederick County. And you'll see we put the disclaimer on there. Not every single case is going to fit perfectly into this protocol. We absolutely understand that. The idea was to give a guideline so that if anybody would like to see this, the rest of the protocol talks about, one, defining what a high-risk victim is. So high-risk victim is not necessarily a victim who has disclosed trafficking or has been identified as a trafficking victim, but it has a number of factors that makes them high risk to be a trafficking victim in the future. We think about, long-term runaways or, multiple runaways within a short period of time, an individual who has prior sexual abuse or assault history, things like that that make an individual more high risk to become a trafficking victim. And what we also do is we go through and based on each agency. So for example, if CPS identifies a victim, what are the next steps that CPS takes once they identify? Who are the people that they reach out to? How are the contacts made? Same for if DJS identifies a victim, hospital identifies a victim, law enforcement identifies a victim, and we kind of go through for each of those different locations of identification. And then we also parse out whether the victim is a juvenile or an adult, and how, if they're an adult versus a juvenile, there's different ways that we go about making these contacts and who is involved. So if anyone's interested in seeing our protocol, like I said, I'm more than happy to share that. Just go ahead and shoot me an email. And then here's our MOU. It's all of the same agencies, and we just go through and talk about confidentiality standards of each of the different agencies, and then creation of the Victim Services Fund. And this is how we are able to have our MDTs and share information. Obviously, not all information can be shared. Those of you who work with individuals who work under a VAWA or VOCA grant understand that sometimes they have additional confidentiality. They might not be able to share everything, but even the information they're able to share is still helpful. Our community outreach subcommittee's mission statement is to aim to increase public awareness of human trafficking, provide prevention education to at-risk populations, and offer trainings for agencies who encounter victims of human trafficking in Frederick County. So what our community outreach subcommittee has done is we've done a lot of community awareness events. These are just some of them. We did a HT in the Internet event. We did a community volunteer day. We do a summit every year. Our summit is actually this Friday, where we send information out to the general public. We have speakers that come in that speak on a variety of topics. And we really are just trying to get out into the community and let them know that this is an issue. This is how you can identify victims or survivors. And these are the resources that are available for those individuals. We've also done a ton of agency trainings. We hit this really, really hard in the beginning of the HTRT. We trained 19 different agencies. There were 370 attendees. Many FCPS, our local public school staff, were in attendance. And then we did 2 separate HT 201 trainings with experts in the field. And our thought was to really get out and educate our community partners on how do you identify this? What is it? What does it look like? And we found that based on that training, you know, we increased our partnerships, we expanded our partnerships, and then we were able to reach out to each other if there were questions, if there were concerns, if there were identified victims. So we really pushed that hard in the beginning. And as we've continued with the HTRT, if there's additional trainings that have been requested, we certainly reach out and do those. So here is our HTRT contact information. We do have a Gmail address. We have a website on our county website, and then we also have a Facebook page. Feel free to follow that page if you would like. And then going to Frederick County and what we're seeing in Frederick County. So in 2022, the Frederick County Sheriff's Office identified and arrested 2 traffickers from 2 different cases. We had 6 identified victims from those cases, as well as several unidentified victims. The Frederick City Police Department identified and arrested 1 trafficker. One of those was a joint investigation from the Sheriff's Office. So they worked together on a case. There was two different locations, one in the county, one in the city, 3 identified victims and several unidentified victims. Our hospital identified and serviced 8 victims of trafficking. Hartley House, I do not have the number of victims and or survivors that they have provided services to last year, but I know that the regional navigator caseload is 49 individuals, which is a pretty significant number. And we're glad that we have our regional navigator to provide services for those individuals. The cases that we've been seeing most frequently in Frederick And I think part of this is probably because of COVID. I think it's also the geographical location of Frederick. When people ask me about trafficking in Frederick, I indicate it's very different than trafficking in Baltimore City or Baltimore County. I was a prosecutor in Baltimore County prior to coming in Frederick, and I worked these cases actually when Amanda Rodriguez, if anybody knows her, worked in Baltimore County. And trafficking in Baltimore County, there are some similarities. Recruitment, hotel trafficking, yes, that exists in Frederick, but it's different. A lot of times Frederick is pass-through trafficking. So, you'll have an individual who's coming from DC or Baltimore. They stay a week or so in Frederick and then go up to Philly or New York. So it's very different type of trafficking than is seen in more of the metropolitan areas. We also see, we had a case where the victim was from DC and the defendant was from DC as well. They came up to Frederick because hotels were cheaper. So their profits were higher. So it looks different here. I also think because of COVID, we are now seeing more of the Asian massage parlors as well as the Hispanic brothels. One of the brothels, we did do a takedown actually in 2021. And we determined after the takedown and the identification of the individuals involved, they had actually had previous operations in Prince George's County. So that just, to me, enhances the need for all of us to get together, to collaborate, to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we're sharing communication, we're sharing target information. I know that recently our detectives, I think it was again PG County, reached out to us because they had identified a location up here in Frederick. So it, to me, just emphasizes we need the collaboration. We need to stay working together so that we can best serve these victims and survivors throughout the state of Maryland. Most recently in 2022, our two takedowns there were two different Asian massage parlor, well, three different locations, two different traffickers. So that's kind of a roundup of what we're seeing in Frederick County right now. This is my contact information. That is my direct office line. Email is the best way to get a hold of me because I'm in and out of court, in and out of the office. Email is the best way to get a hold of me. I get it on my phone, fortunately or unfortunately. So feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about our HTRT, any questions about how we work cases in Frederick County, need any assistance, you have a target up here, a victim, anything that you need, please reach out to us. If you'd like our protocol or MOU, I'm happy to share that. And I'm very thankful, Renee, for you guys including us in this, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to present to everyone.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay. And there have been requests for the MOU and for the protocols, so that's awesome. Just a couple of, I do actually have a couple of questions. So, and if others, please put them in the chat because now is a wonderful time. And again, we are going to change the format so that we're all in the same room. We all can chat, unmute and talk or use the chat function. But at one of the breaks, we're going to do that. It'll mean that we all get kicked out and we'll have to sign back on with the new format. So, but we'll figure out the best time to do that. But in the meantime, Lindsay,
yeah.
I do have a question about the fundraising. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of how this SAO, how the State's Attorney's Office is able to do that? Because it may provide illumination for others of us who are government, and how do we do that separate from our line item budgets?
So what we have done so far is because of the MOU, we were able to create this Victim Services Fund under the State's Attorney's Office. So, and we do have to have a separate guidelines on how the funds are expended and who gives authorization and what the values are to be able to expend those. The only way so far that we have built the account is through requesting payment through our summit. So we charge a registration fee for the summit. The registration fee goes completely to the Victim Services Fund. And that, so we actually are not charging one this year, because of COVID and we didn't have a summit last year and we wanted to make it available for everyone. But In the past several years, how we have done it is that we charge a registration fee for our summit, and we indicate to all attendees that it's going directly to the Victim Services Fund. So that has been the way that we've funded it so far. We have not done any additional fundraising for it yet.
No, that is awesome. And then I was curious, what, if anything, are you seeing regarding labor trafficking? Because we know it's happening under our noses, probably more than sex, but we're not catching it. So kind of what's your take? What's about what's happening there in Frederick?
So our summit 2 years ago, we did do a presentation on labor trafficking and how to investigate these cases. I think, you know, Renee, you and I have been doing this for a long time. And, you know, going back to the very beginning, when we were first trying to get people to realize that sex trafficking was happening and was a thing, I think that we're at this point now where we've finally gotten the attention that sex trafficking is a thing, it's happening, and this is how we investigate. I feel like we are in the beginning stages of, we really need to push labor trafficking, and this is the ways to investigate it. And as you know, the ways to investigate labor trafficking, I feel like, are very different than traditional criminal cases. You need to partner with a lot of agencies, which detectives and criminal investigators don't usually partner with. I am actually going to be meeting with an investigator this week regarding a labor trafficking case. I've had a couple of other ones that have been run by me, but I agree with you. I think it's definitely happening. I think the issue is that our investigators, perhaps just, we need to work more on how to, you know, what agencies we need to reach out to, and also making sure that the information that's being reported that might be a labor trafficking tip is getting to our investigators and not just stopping at those county or statewide agencies who deal with labor and employment issues, that if something's happening, it's getting to our criminal investigators so that we can investigate it. I think the fact that we now have a criminal labor trafficking law on the books should help with that, because I think before, people didn't know what to do with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And I agree with everything you said. And it's sort of a shift of culture, changing culture, and really getting people to identify and know where to push it forward, and then resources for law enforcement, and really, right. It is a whole paradigm shift. I agree. If I can ask, the labor cases that came, past you, or that, without divulging any, things, I'm curious as to what industries you were seeing them in Frederick County.
The one that is coming up, I do not have any information on other than it's labor. I'm meeting with the investigator, so that one I'm not sure. The other one, I'm thinking back, because it was, I want to say 2 to 3 years ago. I believe it was farming.
It was, I'm sorry?
Farming.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. So in Frederick County, I'm assuming there are a lot of farms or agriculture.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I know it is. I'm making assumptions just based
Yes. No, you're
on
correct.
Photography. Yeah. Okay. No, that's super, super helpful. Let's see if there are any other questions in the chat for Lindsay. I think, Lindsay, you gave us your information. That was one of the things to get the wonderful resources that you have.
And I can also, if it's easier, I can just send the protocol and MOU to Caitlin, and then
that would be awesome.
She can send it out.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much. I think there's just so much that we can learn from each other. And we really, really appreciate the time that you took to come to present. We hope that you can stay, because that's also part of the learning and sharing. So it's wonderful to see that you guys have thought of getting that victim, funding, right?
Yeah.
Our task force was stood up in 2013, and I was involved once the law was passed. I was at the state's attorney's office at that point, so I wasn't on the ground floor with the setting of it up. I'm pretty sure, though, there were discussions about funding for survivors, but maybe not as much as if maybe we state's attorneys had been involved at that time. So it's wonderful. We've got participants here that are setting up their task forces or collaborative. And so for them to hear that on the ground, you know, at the beginning, it's important to get that established. It's awesome, because we would have been light years ahead had we been able to get that. So we appreciate that and what you have brought to us regarding your journey in that. So thank you. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Lindsay.
Of course.
So let's see. Caitlin is, oh, Rashida is here. Wonderful. Okay. We are going to hear some brief remarks. Thank you, from our awesome partner, the District of Columbia Human Trafficking Task Force, Rashida Prolio, who is Esquire, who is also the chair of the task force, and she is the chief of the Child Protection Section of the Office of the Attorney General for the District of Columbia. So, Rashida, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Renee, and thank you so much for having me. And I'm sending huge warm welcomes and greetings from the DC Human Trafficking Task Force. We've been around since 2004 and originally started with the United States Attorney's Office in DC, with their office being the chair of the task force. And then during COVID, actually, our office, the DC Office of the Attorney General, joined as co-chairs of the task force. And that is one of the fortunate positions that I have. In DC, we've got 4 subcommittees. We've got a labor trafficking subcommittee. We have a direct services subcommittee. We have a legislation and policy subcommittee. And then the one that is near and dear to my heart is the training and outreach subcommittee. And the training and outreach began really kind of partnering with the PG Human Trafficking Task Force a little over, I'd say the end of 2020 is when we kind of formalized our partnership and put on a series of trainings over about a 9-month period, which I'm very, very proud of, and really just wanted to encourage. And I heard Renee say that there are people in attendance that are maybe starting or trying to start a task force, or trying to start even if not a task force, maybe a multidisciplinary team to partner with like-minded, passionate individuals across various disciplines to help our survivors. And just really wanted to encourage everyone that is starting out, and also those that are deep in the fight, because as we know, working with survivors it presents a lot of challenges and can take even those that are trying to help on an emotional roller coaster. So having your people, having your support network is always very important. One of the, I deeply value the relationships that we have with PG, because there have been times when not even talking about task force things, but I've been able to reach out to Renee and say, we're really struggling on a particular issue with someone that, and some of the trafficking we believe is happening in PG County. So can you support? And Renee being able to connect us to law enforcement, child welfare professionals in that jurisdiction has really been fortunate, has really been a valuable thing. So I just want to encourage people to seek out like-minded and passionate folks that share your passion for this work, and to reach out to those that are already in this space. And if I can be a support or resource for anyone through the DC Human Trafficking Task Force, please let us know. Oh, last thing I wanted to note is that we have a meeting coming up on January 31st, and we will have a presentation from the organization Black and Missing. And we think that it will be a really informative discussion. So please feel free to join us. If you are so inclined, I will provide that login information to Renee and Caitlin if anyone is interested in joining.
Awesome. Why, thank you, Rashida. Is there not something more you would like to share?
Well, I mean, certainly I can talk for a while, so I was trying to be
Well,
encouraging, inspiring, and pretty quick, but I'm happy to dig a little bit deeper, even if folks are interested. And I can just tell you, in sort of backing up about why, which I think this is a helpful message, why we even reached out to PG in the first place to forge that relationship is, as Renee noted, I am a section chief in the child protection section with the Office of the Attorney General. And that section handles the civil prosecution of child abuse and neglect, and they represent the DC Child and Family Services Agency. That in DC, we have a unique way of working with young people that are in the child welfare system or that are in the juvenile system when there are concerns or risk factors for trafficking, or even if they are confirmed to be in the life, is a court program called Hope Court. And that court is very unique in the sense that it is a treatment court. So for youth that are in the juvenile system that have certain delinquency cases or status offenses, which would be PINs, person in need of supervision, runaway or truancy cases, if there are trafficking risk factors present, they have the opportunity to participate in this court, and successful completion of the court means that they can have their those underlying charges dismissed. For youth that are in the child welfare system, they have the child welfare agency noticed over a period of time when you have youth that are in the life or significant risk factors. And as we all know, sometimes the only difference between a youth that is or someone that is confirmed to be in the life or heavy risk factors is the lack of a trusted relationship, to be able to have that conversation, or the lack of a criminal investigation or criminal prosecution. And those can be difficult to come by. So in Hope Court, at risk versus confirmed really are treated the same in terms of the offering of services. And there were many youth that were in the child welfare system and DC has a contract with a provider that is based in PG County. So there are foster homes where DC wards are residing in homes in PG County. And what we were finding is that a lot of our youth, some that were in the life, we were getting allegations of victimization happening not only in DC, but also in PG. And so once that youth crosses that line into that other jurisdiction, there could be challenges in terms of teaming and coordinating, getting information, getting resources, local resources. So that really sparked the need to reach across, go across the line, so to speak, to create those relationships and try to eliminate some of those silos. So that was really kind of the genesis of our partnership with PG, and it has become a very valued one. And I can just say, one more little point that I want to say about Hope Court for youth in the neglect system is that for youth that are in foster care that are experiencing multiple placements, a lot of the manifestations of the trafficking that we were seeing that were impacting not only the youth's ability to really having an impact on their ability to find forever homes, so to speak. We may have families where the child could be reunited with their parent and say the parent mitigated all of the underlying concerns of neglect, but then would say, well, little Johnny can't return home as long as they are continuing to exhibit XYZ behaviors, and going down the long laundry list of things that we know were the risk factors or indicators of them being in the life. Or an adoption, for examul, we had a few cases where we were close to even had a trial, and the court found that adoption was in the youth's best interest, and it then being withdrawn, the petitioner withdrawing because they said, okay, we cannot handle these behaviors or this youth. So all of those things where we said we need to really figure out and kind of drill down deeper and get to, this youth is not just a collection of bad decisions or multiple placements or refusing to engage in therapy or refusing to talk to people or having mental health presentations that some said gave them a diagnosis of bipolar when that really was not going on. We were dealing with excessive trauma. And so just putting together a team, as I mentioned, even about the task force, of highly, highly motivated individuals that are passionate about this work to really dive and dig deeper and figure out what was going on as a way of helping those youth. And that is what Hope Court is all about. The youth are required to come to court, which is different than a traditional neglect calendar, because we want to put some of that power and control back and let those youth know that you are a valued team member, that this is your life and that we see you. We want to know you for who you are and really support and come up with the best possible solution for you.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I love how you highlight the need for all of us to reach across every single, and hence the genesis of this conference, this regional conference, to really, so we can check in with each other and build those relationships. I know that we with Montgomery County, Howard, and DC, we did a reaching across our service providers, our law enforcement and task force to try and we did 2 of those, I think, right? Yeah, last year. So thank you, Rashida. Are there any questions? Yes, actually, there was a comment here I meant to. Somebody's asked, yes, please, can you share the information on the Black and Missing event? So if you can drop it in the chat, that will be great. And if you send it to Caitlin, that's also wonderful, because we can push that out when we push out Lindsay's protocols and MOU. So thank you so much, Rashida. We hope you can stay as well so that we can continue learning from each other. Caitlin, is Dr. Elizabeth here already? Okay, you're muted. I'm sorry. No?
Oh, sorry. She'll be a minute.
Okay, so I'm wondering, and this is for everybody, because we're talking about changing the format so that, we can see each other and we can engage more. Although we are using the chat wonderfully, but I like us to be able to really to do a little bit more. Is this a good time, or should we wait until after Dr. Elizabeth to maybe change the format? And if we change the format, we should be able to still use the same login. Does anybody know?
Share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see this? Sometimes my computer is wonky and there's weird gray bars across stuff.
Yep, we can see.
You can see. Okay. Okay, so this is the Restoring Ivy Collective. This is our little presentation about us. I'm actually going to go and jump into our website in a minute as well, but this gives you kind of an overview of who we are. Here's our little our logo here, this guy, and we've got a bigger logo as well. So who was Ivy? Why the Restoring Ivy Collective? So Ivy was my working name when I was exploited. It was a pseudonym used for the adults that trafficked me, and to sort of it became almost another persona, and it actually for me was one of those things where well, it having, so in sex work, in exploitation, which there is a lot of overlap, and I will say that there's a big difference between trafficking and exploitation in terms of trafficking and exploitation and sex work, which is choice and consent, right? I was under the age of 18, which means that I couldn't consent, but also there's a lot in the literature that we know that says that folks in sex work oftentimes have been exploited at some point. And so there's this kind of understanding of the world as this is the value of my body. This is what I bring to the table, right? So, so when I was exploited, sort of my first experiences with that was around the age of 13. By the time I was 17, I had been brought in by a girlfriend at my high school to an escort service, which sort of just started the ball rolling down that path of different brothels and things. But so Ivy was the name that I used pretty consistently during those years, and actually became, for me, another persona onto which I projected all of the bad things that were happening. And even to the point that when I got out, I was 21, and I got pregnant with my son, and I would say to my child's father, like, oh no, I didn't do those things, Ivy did those things, right? Like there was this, and it wasn't even, so I don't have DID. I wasn't like a different person per se, but there was a lot of dissociation that happened, but it really was almost like a safe place for me to put all of those feelings and all of those traumas and all of those things so that I could move forward, and so that I could be mom, and I could be student, and I could be all of these other things that I wanted to focus on in my life at that point. And what ended up happening was, me heading into violent relationships and things into my 20s, and just, can't just sort of put a little box over trauma and pretend like it doesn't exist. So it took me a lot of years, which is why a Dr. Beth sits before you, because I did not want to talk about my trafficking situation until after I had my PhD, which I defended in 2020 over Zoom. And thank you. Got that at Catholic University, but on my MSW, I teach at Gallaudet University now in the MSW program, but I got my MSW from Gallaudet. They really took me in when I was in bad shape, and I was pregnant with my second child when I started my MSW program. And just, 2 years out of my exploitation, and really trying to find myself. And I felt like I found myself in social work. I felt like I found a calling in social work, and ended up going into child welfare for a number of years. And then the Restoring Ivy Collective has kind of come to be after all of that, right? So I had the credentials and the experience and things to come back and say, I know how to supervise people. I know how to do organizational management. My dissertation was on organizational culture and child welfare, and how to reduce burnout and increase commitment, and support your staff essentially. So this nonprofit is built on the belief that we are all valuable, that we aren't just the sum of our trauma. And I know a lot of times in spaces where there are trafficking survivors, we talk a lot about survivor leadership, or survivor this, or lived experience informing things, right? It's important. And also, there is a level of having people that are ready to do that, and we'll talk more about sort of how to engage with survivors, but I think that that's something that's important to touch on today, and that's something that we are really intent on doing in our organizational mission. We intentionally do not go into depth with sharing trauma stories as a fundraising tool. Like, that is not a thing that we will be doing. Partially because I don't know a survivor who goes out and tells their whole trauma story and then doesn't need to take like 2 or 3 days off from work afterwards, right? I would guess if I were to ask any one of you to tell me a really horrifying story from your childhood, that you would have the same reaction. So, so really thinking about, our stories may be more sensationalized, right, in the media and our social media culture and so forth, and people are more and more often sharing things about their trauma. Trafficking is almost a shorthand word for rape, violence, molestation, near-death experiences, hospitalizations, pregnancy complications, and drug abuse, and all of these, and homelessness, and you know, and then on top of all of that is the commodification of your body, that there is a value that someone has ascribed to saying how much this part of you is worth, that act from you is worth, right? So if you think about it like that, right, that's part of why it's so sensational, is because it's not just like one trauma, it's like a whole bunch of ones that are all wrapped up together, and oftentimes occur over periods of years. So if we think about it like that, right, we want to think about when we're asking somebody to talk about that for no reason, other just, I mean, so if you're here in trafficking spaces, there's tons of resources. There's places to read about it, right? Polaris has quotes from survivors and things that you can read in their recent study that they did, that we all, a whole bunch of us contributed quotes and things to, so you can get a sense of what survivors go through. There's a ton of great memoirs. Girls Like Us by Rachel Lloyd, so good. Scars and Stilettos by Harmony Dust, I think was the name she used on that memoir. Both, those are two of my favorites. But there's the Eve's Angels lady wrote one also, that's really good. But there's a number of really good books out there that give you a sense of what it's like to be trafficked, if you want to have kind of, it's not a universal experience, but you'll get a sense. There's documentaries, there's all kinds of stuff. So you don't need to ask a person that's sitting in front of you to tell exactly what happened to them as a child or as an adult. Think about it as asking a rape victim to describe to you the gory details of their rape. Okay, so just framing that up. So we know that a lot of people are trafficked, not just women, but there's all kinds of risk factors and things that come into place. Ultimately, these are based in the idea of social vulnerability and the fact that we as a society miss the mark with some folks, right? Like, so foster youth, it's not just because they're in foster care, it may be because of lack of supervision or lack of attachment figures, or even the monetization of the self that comes from the check and having a dollar value ascribed to how much they are worth for their care. So, you know, these things that we talk about, it's like, okay, if we're missing things as a society, when we intersect with these populations, the vulnerability is created not because of something that's deficient in that person, but because of something that's missing in our social system that are meant to support them. So again, thinking about that as, okay, how do we, as the systems that are meant to support young people and trafficking survivors who maybe have already had some vulnerabilities created by being in the life, right? How do we fill those gaps so that a trafficker doesn't come into it? Because the trafficker is going to see where those gaps are. Like they are like AI, like screening through, figuring out like where are the things that this person needs. And then I'm going to say that I'm going to fill those needs. Now, maybe they do and maybe they don't. Usually they do for a little while. And then it turns into, okay, now you owe me, right? And so how do we as a society, how do we as social systems, foster parents, child welfare systems, educators, neighbors, right? Like how do we, churches, everybody, how do we come together and just identify that youth that seems really lonely or seems like they need something, right? And be that for them so that a trafficker doesn't. And I think that a big part of my exploitation was the fact that it was so normalized among my friend group because all of my girlfriends in middle school were being exploited and everybody had been raped by an adult, everybody. There was only like, 4 of us in my friend group, but we all had the same basic violent experiences. And so when a woman came along when we were older teens and said, hey, you can be empowered. You can decide who gets to touch you. You get these, and it's just dance, and it's just this, and it's, whatever, right? You buy into this narrative because what you're missing is that freedom of choice. And I think that, there's all kinds of different things that are offered to trafficking survivors that when they are exploited, that they're offered this thing that meets a need that they have. So, all right, so I'm gonna jump to the next. So these are the sort of, when I talk about the complicated things, this is by no means a full list. But these are, sex trafficking survivors go through a whole lot of stuff. I was a heroin addict, among other things. Heroin was my favorite, but it's not like I wouldn't do crack, cocaine, etc. if available, because I didn't want to feel my feelings, because I couldn't handle the symptoms of my PTSD, because etc. Right? Like there was all kinds of issues, and I not every survivor I know is an addict. That's certainly not a universal thing, but the research tells us that this is something that more often than not, trafficking survivors turn to drugs as a way of coping with the trauma, rather than this idea that like, oh, I started like looking for drugs because I started looking for sex work because I was a drug addict, right? It tends to be the other way around. So we know that there's all kinds of forced criminality, financial exploitation, and other things that happen, often sexual assault, chronic health issues. I personally had to have a pelvic floor reconstruction and hysterectomy at 30, but had all kinds of chronic reproductive pain stuff pretty young. Some of that's hypermobility, some of that's trauma to the region. And I've been surprised in trafficking spaces how many people I've met that had to have young hysterectomies. So for what that's worth, it's an odd one, but seems to be all over the place. It's actually, so this is another thing. It's like, for me, going into these anti-trafficking spaces with other survivors rather than providers, but in spaces where it's just us, and I'll talk about my stuff, and there's always somebody else who has that thing, right? Who gets what I'm talking about, like in the depths of their soul. They're like, yes, exactly. And I'm like, I've never had this before. Like, there's no other spaces where, I mean, NA and AA meetings, God knows, those were like the worst places. There's always some creepy dude trying to, pick up and right. So like, we are doing closed support group around addiction recovery for survivors, because we want to have these spaces where like nobody's groping your ass at the end when you're saying a prayer, right? Like that's the but being in spaces where somebody gets you and gets your trauma, and also our support groups are not a place for trauma dumping, and so we'll sit and we'll talk about life and life after trauma and parenting after trauma, and like weird stuff that is really specific to those experiences. So this is one of the more like shameful things that I tend to only admit in survivor spaces, but both of my kids have some nighttime anxiety. They are 15 and 17. When they were little, I had panic attacks pretty much every night. I would sleepwalk around the house. Sometimes it was funny, like I would eat. And then other times, most often I was checking locks or standing by the door with a bat. I very often would carry them out of their bedroom and put them in my bed and then barricade the door with furniture. So, just a lot of stuff of feeling unsafe, and therefore they grew up with this sense of like the world isn't safe, which is something that I kind of still believe. Those of you who work in anti-trafficking, you might be right there with me. I will say working in child welfare during those times did not help my beliefs that the world is not a safe place. But you know, having this sense that like that it is different, that these and that if these things happen to anybody, right? Like Bill Gates was exploited for his childhood, right? He would have panic attacks. Like none of us are immune. This is a human experience. So so this is what, you know, like there's sort of a crudité of trauma symptoms, and usually everybody doesn't get all of them, right? Like sampling a crab rangoon, or like you're eating like a little baby brie, right? Not everybody gets all of the symptoms, but there's a similarity in the way that the brain responds, and the way that like the symptoms show up. It's like how the DSM exists, right? It's like over and over again you see that this is how the human brain responds when exposed to extreme trauma, whether it's war, whether it's violence in one-on-one settings, whether it's trafficking, all kinds of stuff. And so you know, survivors having panic attacks, survivors having challenges that they have in varying situations is natural and normal. And it doesn't mean that I'm not still responsible, right? Like I have to take care of myself. But one of the big things that we really talk a lot about in our organization is boundary setting, and making sure that it's not just time for self-care, but that your organizations that are employing survivors and working with survivors are taking into account that there's going to be an added layer that you need to provide. And realistically, if you want to be a trauma-informed organization, really anything that you're doing in child welfare, we know that a majority of workers have some history of trauma. May not be sexual exploitation specifically, but they have some history of trauma, and that's part of why they go into the helping professions in the first place. So if we have that information already, we know the research tells us most human services folks have some history of trauma that's related to why they chose the path that they did. As organizations, we need to take into account, okay, people are going to need time off. People are going to need EAP resources, maybe wellness space, consistent supervision, right? All of these different things that acknowledge, not just saying, the trauma thing, but we are being clear and transparent and following sort of those 6 tenets of trauma-informed care that the NIH that put those out. I'm not sure. There's a model that's 6 tenets of trauma-informed care. I feel like we should have that reference, but transparency, voice and choice and empowerment, confidentiality in sharing your information with people, like reasonable confidentiality in the workplace. There's a number of different pieces to that where you're being really intentional in the way that you build out your policies and procedures and the way that people behave around them. What do we prioritize as leadership? Do we say the most important thing is meeting the benchmarks and getting the reports in? Or the most important thing is that our staff are healthy and happy and coming to work and not missing work all the time because they're burnt out? So being more relationship-based rather than more benchmark-driven, and pushing back to funders and contract holders and so forth with that model and saying, okay, we need to build in time for our supervision and for our wellness initiatives and so forth, right? That this is actually valuable. Like Google and their sleep pods and foosball tables are doing like head and shoulders above what we in the human services are doing. And yet we're supposed to know all of the things that human beings need, but we don't treat our staff that way. We treat them like it really, like I have to tell you, working in child welfare, there's a lot of stuff that it feels like exploitation, feels like you're expendable. Like either you show up and you do the thing I need you to do, or we'll find another girl who will, right? And that's not acceptable. If we're trying to be an anti-trafficking movement, if we're trying to empower survivors, not just of commercial sexual exploitation, but of anything, we need to really be thinking about how our organizations are being more trauma-informed as a holistic program evaluation metric. Okay, getting off my high horse, I promise.
Sorry, Dr. Beth, I hate to cut you off, but we did have a chat that the box is there, the one that you were mentioning.
Oh, no. Okay. High floating meeting controls. Did this work?
It moved it up.
Actually, on mine, it got rid of, oh, it
Oh.
did move it up. I see it. No,
Yep,
it's gone.
it's red. Yep. And then there's one more on the right side.
I don't know. I don't know how to, I don't know. Is it gone now?
It's going away. Yes, it's going away
Getting
a
almost
little bit higher and then
feel like I'm on a game show. To the left, a little bit to the right. Yeah. Oh,
there you go.
there you
We're
go.
out.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. So here's what we, here's our services at Restoring Ivy. So we have a number of mental health therapy services that we provide. They're just getting started. So our first group was yesterday. We've been doing support groups since October, but our first education and skills-based, arts-based group was yesterday. So we're doing those with youth and adults. We have substance abuse support groups, economic empowerment, social emotional skills groups. So we're using arts and yoga primarily as the interventions, although I am working on a baking therapy curriculum. So hopefully that'll be starting the next month or so. And we're really doing a lot of partnership with agencies in the DMV area. There's a couple of agencies out of the DMV area that are anti-trafficking that I am providing support to remotely. But our goal is really not to be a one-stop shop, but rather to support jail, schools, the shelters, other agencies that need support for trafficking survivors, but maybe don't have the full spectrum of services or need something that's provided by lived experience experts. And then we do nationally, we do the outreach and service referrals, including safe house placements. So those are remote services. And I also have a in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, the ability to do diagnostic and treatment plans. All of this service is free. So this is not stuff that we charge for. We are getting foundation funding for these services. Our goal is really just to make sure that sex trafficking survivors are reached in the places where they are. So our staff get salaries and then we go out and we support your agencies. So please reach out to us if you have an interest in hosting a group or a workshop. We do trainings as well for staff. And we are hoping to start a restoration home realistically 2025, not 2024, but we are hoping to start a restoration home for pregnant and parenting survivors. That is high on our list of resources. So I'm going to jump into our website. I can find things here. So this is our website. Please feel free to take a look. Can everybody see the website? Did this come up?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this website, I'm hoping to get something more fancy developed, but I made this, so Google Sites. So we have our monthly newsletter, which you can click and it'll take you to the newsletter. You can email us for more information, for donations and hosting survivor-led groups or consultations or workshops. We've got our little quick exit here. It actually takes you to Pinterest. So if you want to go to Pinterest quickly, you can always come to our website first. And these are our different services. So parenting groups, trauma-informed yoga, smart addiction and recovery, My Life, My Choice, anti-trafficking education, that it's specifically for under age 24, but it is a prevention education. It's a 10-week group that is, you have to be certified to do it, and you have at least one survivor involved, so, and one clinician. So we, when I facilitate, we have 2 survivors and then the clinician as well. And then we also have a clinician on our board who is in the process of getting certified to provide that as well. So we're looking to work with DYRF and some other folks as people are interested in hosting that particular group. Oftentimes we find that people are identified as survivors through the process of the training. And so if you're saying to yourself, oh, we don't have any trafficking survivors at our agency, or, oh, we haven't identified anybody as a survivor, that doesn't mean that you don't have them. It just means that they haven't been identified or self-identified yet. And so sometimes having survivors come and talk to your group and just say, hey, here's what trafficking is. Here's, you know, some of the stuff that we deal with, and you know, here's what's worked for us for healing. Like that can help with self-identification as well. We are primarily a expressive arts based modality kind of framework as an organization. So we use a lot of arts, plays, crafts, and so forth. And then we also do some bibliotherapy with the younger crew, and yoga. And so the yoga, we have yoga therapy, which I facilitate, and then we've got like a yoga emotional skills group as well. And so then we also, these are our two support groups. We have one on Friday nights from 8:30 to 9:30 Eastern. These are LGBT folks, all genders, 18 plus for both. And then female identifying folks is Mondays from 12 to 1 Eastern. I facilitate that one. Liz Kimball facilitates the Friday night. And then I already showed you some of this, but this is our staff. So Liz is the program specialist. I'm the director, and Kyla is our life skills person. So both of them are yoga people and art people as well. But Kyla tends more towards the economic empowerment side and focusing on life skills and leadership development. Liz is our creative, and she is very much into survivor empowerment, media training. And she's working on a parenting skills curriculum for us as well, because that's one that we feel really strongly about. We want to have that up and running this year. So probably by spring, summer, we should have that group ready to go. And this is our board. They are awesome. We originally tried to do an old survivor board and found that we were missing skill sets. So these folks are, all these ladies are very awesome and hardcore. Erin Henderson Moore is the director of United Health Group in DC, and she's got a degree in nonprofit management. Jess owns Yoga Heights in DC and is a business person / yogi. Shamir McKenzie, I believe in this space, her name probably precedes her, but she's a survivor leader, but has like tons of legislative advocacy experience and is a pretty heavy hitter in the legal spaces and policy spaces. Melanie Cantwell has many hats. She used to work for the Navajo Nation as a case manager, Indian Health Service, I guess, and then was with I can't remember the name of the people that booked the anthem and all of that. And she now is a real estate agent, but is our lead fundraiser. Coco Eva is the vice chair. She's a specialist in diversity and inclusion, and again, big heavy hitter in the anti-trafficking space, and has been doing advocacy work for a long time. Peta Gay is a clinical social worker and one of my best friends. She's amazing clinician, works for DYRS, and she is hoping to do the My Life, My Choice curriculum when she's trained. And then Allison is an attorney who works for the Human Trafficking Institute and is a research person and a lawyer specializing in human rights. You want more information about their bios, you can click through here and it'll give you everybody's bios. And then this is sort of what I wanted to touch on related to how to talk to survivors. So these are conditions under which not to ask the survivor to share their story. If you're in front of a group and you haven't talked about it ahead of time, right? You want to check privately if it's okay. If they've recently come out of their exploitation, not a good idea. Recently meaning a couple of years. If it isn't absolutely necessary to the project that they're working on, this isn't entertainment. This is not, this isn't, and it isn't the only thing that they have to offer for most of us. If we're working in this space, we have other things, other reflections that we can provide, and other, things about our healing journey, reflections on the anti-trafficking movement, things to inform research, and so creating spaces for them to be heard, not just about their story, is really important in survivor empowerment. And you want to make sure that you're talking to them ahead of time about what roles they're interested in, where are they trying to grow to, providing compensation, providing voice and choice. So that's all important. And then I also have a little thing, an infographic here about not using imagery in anti-trafficking that shows tied up or abused women, women with hands covering their mouths, or children, any of that. Because that's really sensationalizing the bad stuff that happened to you, rather than empowering survivors towards like the anti-trafficking piece, right? Like that's trafficking. What we're talking about is like healing and getting out of that space and creating opportunities for people to regain their power. These are triggering. These are triggering, I would argue, probably for most people, but especially for people who have had those things happen to them. We're asking survivors to come into spaces and contribute. Filling the space with trauma triggers is not trauma informed as a practice. So these are some, and then if you want to read more about all the different research things that we've done, there's some information there. We'll be adding to that section. And I saw that we might have some questions in the chat. Oh,
Let's see. Yeah, we've been monitoring.
no, those were not questions. That was just about the black boxes. So I don't know if there are any other questions or things that people just sort of opening up the space about restoring Ivy Collective, or about survivor empowerment and working with survivors. We do have, myself and Brittany Dunn penned a paper, an academic publication on like empowering survivors in the anti-trafficking movement, that is under review. So as soon as that's out, we will have that up on the website as well for folks to read. But there's a lot of good tips in there, some of what I've shared today. We've also presented on it at the International Human Trafficking and Social Justice Conference, and the Network for Social Work Management.
Excellent, excellent. This has been so helpful and really getting us to think in different ways. I particularly liked how you unpacked and really got us thinking about, in organizational spaces, right? Because looking at this holistically, like if we're all committed to the journey of healing, or the journey, right, that we have to think about it long term, right? Not just that 3-6 month, year, 2 years, right? And so I really appreciate sort of the statistics that you gave, especially in the the health and human services. But as you said, we are all right. There's trauma everywhere, right? And so from a corporate perspective, so beginning that education that right, we're not expendable as human beings, and then when you add trauma on top of that, like that's even worse. So how can we better reflect those values that we say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, it's not just about speaking, it's what actions. So
yeah, well, and operationalizing, I think, like organizations that largely employ social workers, we follow the values of, or we're supposed to follow the values of dignity and worth of the person, and
right,
human relationships, and all of that, right? Integrity of practice, all of that.
yeah,
That we should be thinking about how I mean, our code of ethics literally sets leadership and organizations, not just individuals, but leaderships and organizations are supposed to be applying to supervision and to the way that we engage policies and practices for our organization. So I think that that's an important thing to think about. And if anybody's interested, my dissertation is published. It's out there floating around. It's a very long name, but
If we just Google your name
you
and
should
dissertation.
be able to Google Miriam. It's Miriam is my first name, and I don't ever use for anything.
Well, your secret is safe here.
I am, yeah. Yeah, Miriam Elizabeth Bowman is my legal name, and the name of my dissertation, oh, it's so long. Exploring the, what is it? Yeah, I'll have to look for it. How about this? If anybody wants a copy,
Yeah,
email me and I will send you a copy of that or any other publications. I have a child welfare wellness model that was published last year, I think.
yeah.
It was last year. So I've got a number of different like organizational culture and supervision stuff that is helpful. A lot of it is child welfare because that's what I did for 10 years before I came to academia. But what I have found is that there is not just a ton of overlap in our in the youth populations, but in the way that the organizations need to operate. It's very similar because we're serving vulnerable populations. There's crisis needs, there's funding needs, like there's all of this, and working in silos. So we as an organization at the Restoring Ivy Collective, one of our big things is we don't want to be all and end all. Like we're not the case manager. We want to work with organizations who have the case manager already established, and then supplement them with you know, our piece that we add to it, right? So whether it's groups, whether it's just additional treatment planning from a survivor lens, all of that is kind of what we aim to add. We aim to be a piece of the puzzle, not the whole puzzle. So so please keep us in mind as you're looking for resources. We are a free resource. We will come to you, or we will set up a Zoom and we will serve your population. Right now, in terms of getting involved, I saw somebody posted about that in the chat.
Right.
We are not taking volunteers at this point. We are hoping at some point to do volunteering. In fact, one of the goals that we have is to have a volunteer force of people to do childcare for all of our groups. So that way every group we have has childcare for parents, because that's a big part of our mission. But right now, we don't have a volunteer coordinator. We will be taking donations in the next month or so. Our 501c3 letter is, according to the IRS, in the mail. So, you know, it's taken some time. We've talked to some people and we're just waiting on that. So, and yeah, that whole process is nuts, but that is not stopping us from doing what we do. So we are out and we are helping, and we would love your support.
Outstanding. So if you could drop into the chat your email, because there are
Yes.
several, myself included, I definitely want to read the dissertation, and we would
It's so
love, I would
long.
love to- yeah, that's okay. The big words that I don't understand, I will be calling you. So,
Oh, no. Yeah, no, there were people on my committee that didn't understand some of the words. So I have to, that I had like committee members that were like, I had to go back to the text.
that's funny.
So yeah, it's complicated because it's a secondary analysis, it's big data. So I just put my email in the chat. If you want copies of stuff, just email me and let me know what copies of what that you would like, and we'll send it. And we'd love to just kind of connect with each of you because yeah, you guys are doing great things at your organizations, and we want to be a part of it. So.
Right. Could you also actually send us a copy, because we can always send it out?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you can send it, right, the
Dissertation
dissertation, the dissertation, and also the thing that you did about the, yep, child welfare, you know, all of that. That would be amazing.
Okay, I have a lot of papers in child welfare, but I'll send the wellness model one.
Okay, excellent. So let's see. So Andrea, so it was
Oh.
right there, Andrea. It was before.
No, I sent it to hosts and panelists.
Oh, sorry.
Getting it
someone could
here.
pop that in. Yeah. Thank you, Andre, for that.
Yeah.
I think maybe the way it's set up, but we're going to fix that.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, Andre, can you see that now? Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, thank you. Actually, I did have a real quick question because you said it a couple of times. I want to make sure that I understand. So as part of sort of the 6 models or modules of trauma informed for organizations, you've mentioned this idea of supervision when you mentioned sort of transparency and voice, choice, confidentiality. Unpack that just a little bit, like, because people may hear that different ways.
Okay, so I'm dropping the link in the chat.
Okay.
It is the CDC that put it out.
Mhm.
And there's a nice little infographic as well. But the guiding principles are safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support, collaboration, and mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice, and cultural, historic, and gender issues. So essentially, it's taking each of these and looking at your policies and procedures. And so, and by that, I mean, like policies like discrimination policies. We, going through My Life, My Choice, are required to have a CSEC, the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children mandated reporter policy. That's something that they ask you to do. But really, any anti-trafficking organization should have some kind of mandated reporter policy around exploitation and other types of child abuse or adult abuse. But so the policies, we look at those and we say, okay, how are we being trauma informed in each of these policies? And then when we talk about procedural things, some of those may be in the handbook, but some of it is just how are we doing things, right? Like in the day-to-day operations, do we have a daily check-in with our staff to see how they're doing, right? Maybe that's too much. Maybe we have weekly supervision and we make that dedicated time. But those relational pieces, and that we're transparent about all of it. So not just handing your employee a handbook and saying, okay, read this, right? But making sure that if you know over and over again, people bring up this particular thing and they're like, oh, I didn't notice that particular policy and people are violating it, right? Like having a staff meeting that focuses on reviewing the policies or getting input from your staff about the policies in a roundtable or like a focus group, right? So having that combination of transparency and engagement of the staff and helping them to feel invested and feel heard, and taking into account, you know, diversity factors, cultural background, all of that, right? Like a lot of this is just is ethical practices in social work. But the idea is that we're creating spaces that acknowledge different types of trauma, different manifestations of trauma, and try to prevent vicarious trauma and additional trauma from workplace experiences. So it's not just saying, oh, you already have trauma, let's treat you this way. It's saying, I mean, most people have some kind of trauma. So we're going to acknowledge that. We're going to operate in that way for that issue. And we're going to create policies and procedures that don't traumatize people, that don't tell them how their hair has to be, or, you know, or tell people that this particular way of being that they can't control is wrong. Right? Like those kinds of things. I think that's really what trauma informed care is about. It's both the like acknowledging past trauma and trying not to do additional harm, but it's trying not to do harm, period.
Yeah.
That's really the foundation of it. I would encourage you to look at the CDC sort of framework for that. I use that in a lot of training because I love it.
Yeah. Outstanding.
So yeah, so it's a good framework for program evaluation.
Right.
Should be built into any program evaluation that you're doing. It's not just reviewing benchmarks. It's not just reviewing exit interviews, which can be part of it. But it's also looking at like on these particular metrics that might be a little bit more qualitative. How are we doing?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. You've given us a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope to connect with everybody. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me on this cool event. And yeah, would love to connect with folks. So Kyla Wood is doing most of the DC groups. Liz is doing most of the Maryland groups. Right now, I am doing most of the administration and grant writing and all of the other things, but I am also working with the both of them on some of the groups that require 2 people. And I run the support group on Mondays, and we'll probably be adding a second one because that one is growing. So yeah, but I'm here to support. I'm here to support your staff. Lots of experience in supervision and management. I trained on that for a number of years, and so happy to do trainings on that. I have in the pipeline a couple of like staff wellness, organizational cultural trainings coming up, and also happy to train on HT 101. We train on disabilities and accessibility related to trafficking too. I'm at Gallaudet University, so the deaf community stuff is one of my main issues. Do we have an interpreter for this meeting? Were there any?
Right, we didn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
didn't know. I didn't know if we had any requests for that or not.
There hadn't. If there was, we definitely would have. But we try to be intentional about language access, period. Of course, that's more of an ADA, but still.
Yeah.
But yeah. So it's always good for that reminder. So thank you.
Gallaudet University, we're in DC. So we serve mostly, our goal, our mission is to serve deaf populations. And our program cranks out social workers that are out there doing work in deaf spaces, social workers in deaf spaces. And I'm in the process of developing an HT 101 in ASL with some colleagues. So hopefully we will have that out by summer, fall next year, this fall.
Outstanding.
Yeah, very exciting stuff. Lots of projects. I'm in the research spaces and so forth, as well as the practice spaces, but excited to be partnering with you guys. Also, yeah, if you have deaf consumers that you think that there may be exploitation, feel free to reach out to me. I definitely have some resources in that department as well. And I'm doing a training tomorrow that is open to anybody that wants to come with my program director, Liz, and one of her friends that works at Montclair University. All of us are survivors on disability in and supporting trafficking survivors. So we'll be so if anybody wants that, I can send that to you guys with the other
Please,
stuff.
that would be great. That would be great.
It's free.
Well, that's even better, but but thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Are there any other questions or thoughts? Wonderful, getting people thanking you for your contributions.
I saw my favorite sergeant. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Inzeo?
Kinzia, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It's because we have everybody muted. She can't tell you. So I guess it's whatever I say it is.
Oh,
I'm joking. I'm joking.
That's not trauma informed.
I'm joking. So
Okay.
One
for having me.
parts.
I appreciate it. And I'll
Thank you.
to connecting with any and all of you in the future.
Wonderful. Well, you know that we are going to be, as usual, like
yeah. Hopefully we connect about the task force roadmap, because I'm excited. I have a research project doing evaluating task forces right now. I'm very excited about getting us the inside information for that one.
Wonderful. Yeah, I can see lots of collaboration. So thank you. And thank you for being the Prince Georgian, right? Living.
Yeah, for now.
No, like la 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 la.
Yeah. No, there's my partner ran for DC City Council. He lives in DC, and when my kids are out of the house,
We didn't hear that. We're still claiming you as a Prince Georgian.
Well, I'm still going to be working in PG County. And for the record, I identify as a Virginia. So,
Okay, there we go. All right.
all right. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth. All right, bye-bye. All right, so we have about 10 minutes for a break. So why don't we go ahead and stretch? I know that I need to. And we will come back and we will hear from Dr. Nadine.
Neil, you want to go ahead and start? The slides are, I'll go ahead and introduce myself while you're doing that. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Nadine Finnegan-Carr. I'm the Director of the Prevention of Adolescent Risks Initiative here at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, in the School of Social Work. And in that role, I run projects that are designed to build the infrastructure for Maryland to address issues related to human trafficking, sexual reproductive health, and aggression and violence. And I will allow Neil, now that he has the slides up, to introduce himself.
Great, thank you. So my name is Neil Mallon. I work under Dr. Nadine Finnegan-Carr at the PARI department at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. And as mentioned, under our Maryland Human Trafficking Initiatives grant, one of the things that I've been involved with is leading an effort to better understand child labor trafficking in Maryland. And we're here today to present the findings of a research study that we've been conducting over the past couple of years to really help us kind of better understand this issue locally here in our state.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And Shamara Easley is our graduate research assistant. She couldn't be here with us in person today, but she has assisted with the environmental scan for this labor trafficking project that we are going to be presenting to you today. So a lot of attention has been focused on child sex trafficking here in the state of Maryland, including by ourselves over the past decade or so. And there has been growing attention to the issue now of child labor trafficking. But relatively little is known about the scope and the prevalence of this specific form of trafficking across the US, yet alone here in Maryland. So unlike child sex trafficking, we don't have an existing Child Protective Services policy for this. It's not a separate maltreatment indicator. We only recently, even as a state statute, put a state labor trafficking law into effect right before the pandemic. So there's not even a separate maltreatment indicator in our child welfare management information system. So we don't properly capture when a child is at risk or has been a victim of child labor trafficking. And even when you're looking at it from the concept of federal law, you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for child labor trafficking, just like you would for adult labor trafficking, unlike in child sex trafficking, where as long as it has occurred, you don't have to prove it. So that's the background and the problem that we're undertaking right now. So what we've done is we have conducted an environmental scan, and the reason for this is just to figure out what is going on. And the purpose of doing an environmental scan typically is to understand what is happening from a specific phenomena. So you seek information, you gather it from multiple sources. It might be surveys, it may be literature, reports. All of this information that different people may have been doing, you pull it all together, and then you use it to inform strategic decision-making and to direct future action in a specific area. In this case, for us to act within the issue of labor trafficking and child labor trafficking here in the state of Maryland. It's a very useful practice. It's something to be aware of when there is a topic that there's very little information or data about. And so that's where we are. So what we did at this point is we developed a 3-phase approach, and Neil is going to walk you through what we've done, but it's a 3-phase approach. We did a comprehensive literature review. This is similar to what we did at the beginning, believe it or not, for child sex trafficking. So about a decade ago in 2014, we did this very same thing for child sex trafficking. At this point, it's hard to believe that we were at a point in the state of Maryland where we were trying to figure out, is this a problem? And now we know it's a problem. This is what we're doing right now with labor trafficking. So the first step is a comprehensive literature review of the professional literature. We then conducted a survey of key stakeholders, specialized service providers across the state in order to collect information about who have you served in the past 3 years who may have been victims of child labor trafficking. And then we also conducted an anonymous online survey of public child welfare and juvenile services workers about their experiences serving these same youth who may be at risk for labor trafficking.
All right, so I'll jump in here. We're starting with the literature review. This is some of the results of what we found during that process. So one of the things that stood out was that through the literature, through research that exists, we found that labor trafficking in children may actually be more prevalent than was previously thought. There are actually several studies, 2 in particular, that showed self-report studies of homeless youth, one in Atlanta, another in Chicago, that included several hundred homeless youth and surveyed them using a human trafficking assessment tool. And in both of those studies, of the percentage of youth that did indicate victimization through trafficking, there were higher rates related to labor trafficking as compared to sex trafficking. One of the other things that was interesting of note during our scan of the literature is that the profile of child labor trafficking victims may be much different than victims of sex trafficking. We point to one study in particular that looked at investigations of trafficking by Florida's child welfare system. And when they looked at the profiles of those youth who are reported to have been exploited through labor trafficking, what they found was that those youth were 9 times likely to be male, were younger in relation, less likely to have prior child welfare involvement, and less likely to have subsequent child welfare involvement when compared to the youth victims of sex trafficking that were served by the Florida child welfare system. So those were just 2 things that stood out. The literature also highlights, that there are several barriers to identification of victims of child labor trafficking. One in particular is that there's just a lack of evidence-based screening tools that exist specific to labor trafficking. There are several tools available that have showed fidelity and, strong evidence related to sex trafficking, but not so much for labor trafficking. There's also just a lack of training. Dr. Finnegan-Carr mentions, the PARI department has been overseeing training for child welfare, for mental health, for various child serving professionals across the state, mostly related to sex trafficking over the years. And so just in general, our workforce doesn't have access to that same level of training on labor trafficking as they do on sex trafficking. Additionally, for first responders. The literature also highlights the gaps in investigation and enforcement of unlawful child labor. One, that there's just a lack of resources, that the investigation units within the Department of Labor, do exist, that there are enforcement units that, go into businesses or investigate businesses that may be suspected of unlawful labor practices. But those resources are not nearly enough as the resources that have been dedicated towards the enforcement and investigation of sex trafficking. One of the reasons perhaps is, that labor trafficking often, occurs in, formal business economies. So, restaurants, construction sites, legitimate kind of business practices. So, it may be, a little bit more veiled as opposed to the investigation of sex trafficking, where we have specialized law enforcement units that kind of are able to kind of more target kind of the illicit enterprises that, operate through those networks. The literature also highlights, the reality that this is a complex issue, that there are cases of child labor, children that are working unlawfully. We have labor laws in Maryland. We have federal labor laws that, oversee eligibility for kids to be able to work. In some cases, unlawful child labor kind of blends over into exploitative labor situations where kids may be having wages withheld, working longer hours than are allowed. And then there's, it could kind of blend over even further into what we're focused on, which is labor trafficking, where there is the elements of force, fraud, and coercion used to entrap those youth in those labor situations. Lastly, the one thing that we wanted to highlight that we found related to our scan of the literature was just the vulnerabilities of unaccompanied minors. So as many of you likely know, the federal government has a process in place that if a child enters the United States without authorization and without a legal guardian or parent, they're brought into the custody of the federal government through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They have a network of shelter facilities throughout the country, excuse me, that can temporarily house those children until they're released to sponsor families across the country. And what we've seen in the literature review is that those youth may be more susceptible to being trafficked through labor. Some of the reasons are related to some of the maybe overt pressures to work, that these children may come to the US and work is needed to repay a debt that's owed for being transported or smuggled across international borders into the US. There's also kind of the reality of a lack of knowledge of labor laws and different labor cultural practices, that kids working in other parts of the country, is not uncommon. And there's also sort of this lack of understanding that some of these youth may have when they come to the United States around their workers' rights protections that are afforded to them. And then the reality of a fear of reporting, that if a youth who's unaccompanied and is going through a process of seeking legal protection to remain in the U.S., and they're in this type of situation, that there may be some fears of reporting to police or reporting to an authority. Just to provide context, in fiscal year 2022, the U.S. actually saw the highest number of unaccompanied children in ORR care in at least, as statistics have been captured. And in Maryland in particular, there were over 6,000 children released to sponsor relatives throughout our state. Now, historically, only about 20% of the youth released, the total number of youth released through the Office of Refugee Resettlement were connected with what they call post-release services, where the child is connected with a local service provider on the ground after they're connected and placed with the sponsor family. Under the current administration, there's actually a commitment to having 100% of all youth released from ORR care to receiving post-release services. I don't know the number off the top of my hand right now, but I did reach out to a colleague at ORR to just ask around what percentage currently right now they're at. And it's, I believe, above 50%. It could be even higher. I don't want to quote a number without verifying that, but I can certainly get that information. So we're on, a good trajectory and trend about, making sure that these kids are connected with, services once they are released to sponsors. But just so that for the purpose of this study, we're looking kind of historically and to say, this is a population that is at risk. And, prior to this, move to increasing connections to services, that, there's only about, a fifth of those children had been connected with services upon release.
The one thing I would add to that is the 6,000 youth that are in ORR that were placed in Maryland in FY 2022 may seem high, and it's the highest because it was the highest number. It was a large number for the United States, but Maryland tends to get the lion's share of unaccompanied minors who are brought into the United States proportionally every year. And this has been consistent since the O'Malley administration for Maryland. So I recalled in the O'Malley administration that those numbers were hovering around 3,000. And that was high for then compared to the amount that we're going to other states. So we should consider that, even though this is what our literature review is telling us, this is something that trends will be continuing because it has been continuing now for decades.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that's just a brief summary of the initial work that our team was involved with, just spending several months just collecting, reading, analyzing all of the literature that's available related to child labor trafficking to just come up with some findings that would help us inform the next two phases of our study. So phase 2 was focused around a survey of key stakeholders and specialized service providers. So we knew, not just anecdotally, just given our involvement with the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force, that we knew of organizations in our state that are specialized providers that serve child victims of trafficking. So what we wanted to do was, given that we don't have any kind of one central kind of data repository that captures, information around victims of trafficking, aside from our Child Protective Services data, what we wanted to do was just kind of identify those organizations and survey them on how many youth victims of child labor trafficking they served over the past 3 years. So what we had to do was kind of set a criteria for who we included in that pool of key stakeholders. So we settled on these 4 different areas. So if an organization met any one of these 4 criteria, they were included in our sample size. So if the organization was identified as a Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, a grantee, a TVAP grantee, they were included. If the organization received funding through the Office of Victims of Crime to provide services to child victims of human trafficking, they were included in our sample size. Additionally, we included organizations that are contracted by ORR to conduct home study assessments and provide post-release services to youth in Maryland. And then lastly, we also included legal providers, pro bono, mainly, that provide legal services to child victims of trafficking. So based off of that 4 criteria, what we identified 20 organizations in Maryland that we reached out to. And it was a very simple survey. The survey just asks them no identifying information. We just wanted numbers. We wanted to know the number of youth victims of labor trafficking that were, this was kind of the caveat, it was that they had to be under the age of 18 at the time that they were referred to the organization. They had to have resided in Maryland. And we wanted to know whether those youth were foreign nationals or US-born citizens. So of the 20 organizations, 16 of them responded to our survey. And this is the breakdown of what we found was that, first and foremost, that Maryland has a strong network of providers that serve these youth. The 16 organizations that responded are available resources, that have been identified, that are known, that serve this population, that have, the types of services in place that these children need. But in terms of numbers, what we saw was that there are a fair number of child victims of labor trafficking that are being served currently. And so predominantly, these providers indicated that the youth were foreign nationals. As such, you'll see that only in each year, only one US-born youth was identified. The numbers also increased by year. Now, these are not, some of the youth that were served in 2019 may be included in the numbers in 2020 and so forth. These are not by each year. We were just looking for a count. But even with that being said, you know, between 2019, 2020, and 2021, the numbers increased each year, and that's even in spite of, you know, COVID restrictions that, you know, many service providers faced, and, you know, not being able to reach clients or, you know, youth to survey them or to serve them, I'm sorry. The second part of this phase 2 was that we wanted to capture additional data sources. So, you know, one of the things that we looked at was to reach out to the Office for Trafficking in Persons. So among, you know, many other things, OTIP is responsible for issuing eligibility or interim assistance letters to victims of human trafficking. So there's a process by which there's an application for eligibility that's submitted to their office, and those applications are then screened and reviewed. And if it's determined that the individual was in fact a victim of trafficking, whether that be in their home country, in another country, en route to the United States, or even within the US, that they are eligible for certain benefits, you know, pending, you know, a process by which they can seek immigration relief as a result from that. So we reached out to OTIP to find out how many how many children in Maryland received eligibility letters over the past couple of years. That they're actually in the process of sending us data on FY22, but this just provides some kind of context for what they're seeing, is that of youth in Maryland, in both years, 83% of the applications that they received and letters that were certified were child victims of labor trafficking. So in 2020, of the 12 child trafficking victims that were certified, 10 of them experienced labor trafficking. And then in 2021, of the 30 recipients, 25 experienced labor trafficking. So that led us into phase 3 of our survey. So one of the things obviously that came up was that we didn't really know a lot about US-born children around labor trafficking, you know, as it relates to US-born children. We also, Dr. Finnegan-Carr had mentioned earlier that without having a specific labor trafficking maltreatment indicator included in our state's child welfare information system, there's no data available to us through Department of Human Services, social services departments, or departments of juvenile services on numbers of youth that were suspected or at risk or confirmed to be victims of labor trafficking. Excuse me. So one of the things we did in our literature review, we came across a study by Dr. Annie Fukushima in California. That Dr. Fukushima did a study on the experiences of child welfare professionals in California's child welfare system. And what's interesting is that her first attempt at surveying these child serving professionals was that she just asked directly, had they ever worked or had experience working with a child that was the victim of labor trafficking? And the response rate was very low. But what she did then was conducted the survey a second time, but this time, instead of asking directly just the question of whether or not they worked with a victim of labor trafficking, she actually broke down a series of several questions that actually included language that captured the various elements of labor trafficking. So questions related to, forceful labor practices or coercive, or, situations where youth were defrauded. And then also different kind of contexts and situations. And when the second survey was conducted, what Dr. Fukushima found was that there was much higher rates of response, was that professionals did actually endorse or, report that they had worked with youth in these situations. So, the kind of takeaway, at least from as I read it, was that, a worker may not have the same understanding if you ask them about labor trafficking, but if you ask them details or provide examples of a type of situation that includes those elements, that they may be more likely to in fact, know of youth or have worked with youth in those situations. So just the way we kind of use language can be really important in the way that we ask these questions, especially, when we're surveying a workforce that may not be as knowledgeable about labor trafficking as they are about sex trafficking. So this is the findings from our phase 3 survey. So we had the support of administration through the Department of Juvenile Services and Department of Human Services. They supported us in this process. They helped us with the administration of the survey. We surveyed the entire state's Department of Juvenile Services and Department of Human Services direct line staff that included caseworkers, supervisors, administrators. So we're talking like several hundred professionals that received the survey. Of the ones that we received back, we had just close to 200 completed surveys. 55% of the respondents indicated that they worked in child welfare, 42% reported working in juvenile services. And as I mentioned, there was a mix in that sample of 198 of direct line caseworkers, supervisors, and administrators. What's actually really interesting is that 41% of the respondents reported to have 16 plus years of experience in the field. So we're getting information through this survey from professionals that have worked with lots of kids over the years and been in the field for, on average, 16 years. So there's a wealth of experience and a wealth of, knowledge that came from the individuals that responded. The other thing that was interesting that we were really hoping to get full state representation was that the workers had experience working in almost every county in Maryland, and 23 of the 24 counties in Maryland were represented in our sample size. So these are the questions. Again, we replicated Dr. Fukushima's survey. So we used the same style and questions that she had asked. So instead of asking directly, have you worked with a victim of labor trafficking, the questions were actually kind of tiered. So if the first question that was posed was, have they ever worked with a child or youth under the age of 18 who has been coerced or controlled by another person or entity for their labor, either commercial or non-commercial? So of the 198, 20% reported yes. And then of those 20%, we have several sub-questions. And so I haven't included all of them in this presentation, but I just picked out the one sub-question that I think gives us some good insight, is that of the individuals that answered yes, the second question then was, open to the full sample size. Again, was that how likely are they to work with children or youth in that situation in the future? So if someone reports that this is something that they have experience with, they've also were finding out information on how likely they think it is that they're going to encounter a child in that situation. So question 2 asked about, their experience in working with children or youth who've been defrauded or lied to about the terms of employment. That percentage was a little lower at 16%, but again, when we asked how likely they were to work with those kids in that future, 35% said that it was likely or very likely that they would. The third question asks, have they worked with children or youth under 18 who have been in debt bondage? A person had to provide services to pay off money that they owed another person. This was the one question that I believe was the lowest indicated, that only 7% of the 198 said that they had, but then when we asked how likely it would be that they worked, that percentage jumps up to 27%. The question that received the highest response in terms of workers reporting that they had worked with a child in this situation was question number 4. Had they ever worked with a child or youth under the age 18 who was forced to cultivate, sell, or transport drugs? And 29% of the 198 said that they had worked with children in these situations, and then 39% said that it was likely and very likely that they would encounter these youth in the future, work with these youth in the future. The last 2 questions question 5 was kind of an extension of the concept of forced criminality and labor trafficking, working with children or youth under 18 who were forced to steal, sell, or transport weapons or stolen goods. 15% indicated yes, but 34% said that it was likely or very likely that they would encounter youth in this situation in the future. And then our last question asked, had they worked with children or youth whose important documents were forcibly taken away by their employers, recruiters, or other individuals? Only 4% indicated yes, but 23% said that it may be likely or very likely that they would encounter youth in this situation. So this is kind of some of the conclusions that we took away from that phase 3 survey, that despite the fact that we don't have any reports of child labor trafficking screened by Maryland CPS, the information we receive from the survey of the workforce suggests that there's a significant percentage of child welfare and juvenile services professionals who have reported working with youth who have experienced these elements of labor trafficking. And furthermore, a significant percentage also report that it's likely or very likely that they'll work with kids in these situations in the future. And then also of what we thought was of interest was the fact that the type of labor trafficking that was indicated the most was cases of youth who were forced to cultivate, sell, or transport drugs. And the concept around forced criminality and labor trafficking, in the literature is fairly new, and there's not a lot of research out there that really kind of focuses in on those dynamics. But there is one study in particular that we cite that I think provides some, really, really good information to understand kind of the connection between how gangs use similar tactics as traffickers do in sex trafficking to recruit vulnerable youth and susceptible youth to join the gang. And then the labor of crime is then something that they exploit these children into participating in. So we had a really great presentation, our Maryland annual child trafficking conference this past year. We had a presentation from James Dole. He's the CEO of an organization in Washington, D.C., sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the organization, but James gave a great presentation that really kind of highlighted that these youth that are exploited in this way are often misidentified as victims and often are seen as sort of complicit in these activities, and then obviously, having to go through the criminal justice system. So knowing that we have workers in child welfare, juvenile services that are seeing youth and recognizing that these youth in these situations were, being forced or defrauded or coerced into these crime activities, I think is, something that we really need to kind of recognize and begin to kind of better understand how we understand those dynamics the same way that we, apply that that understanding to victims of other forms of trafficking.
So James Dole is Human Rights for Kids.
Human
Just-
rights for kids. Yeah, thank you.
I didn't want to interrupt you while you were still talking. Yeah, Human Rights for Kids. Thank you, Neil, because that was a lot of information. So from what that we have done with the environmental scan, as I mentioned in the beginning, the purpose of environmental scan is to take what you learn to inform planning to address a phenomena or an issue, and in this case, child labor trafficking. And so Maryland Department of Human Services and Department of Juvenile Services have already begun to take steps to revise their screening tools to include questions specific to labor trafficking. I mean, based on what Neil has shared with you so far, even the information about forced criminality, understanding when youth are either at risk or have been victims of child labor trafficking, and how that may have contributed to their being involved in the juvenile justice system is an important consideration for them in order to make sure that when they are working with them, that they can get them services so that when they are released, they don't end up back in similar situations and back in the juvenile justice system. The Department of Human Services specifically is also in the process of revising their overall child trafficking policies to include guidance on how we can address child labor trafficking. How can we screen these cases in under neglect? Is it risk of harm? How do we work through including these so that they don't slip through the cracks? We are pretty much treating this just like at the very beginning with child sex trafficking. How do we address this? How do we get this integrated into policies without at this time having state statutes and laws and policies and Code of Maryland addressing it? And then more recently, our team, the PARI team and the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services were awarded a 3-year grant through the U.S. Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime. And this new grant does include the development of a training on child labor trafficking, specifically for child welfare and juvenile services professionals, so that they can be more aware of this. And it also includes expanding the Regional Navigator program that is in place so that they can accept referrals for victims of child labor trafficking up to the age of 24, and include training for them on how to address child labor trafficking, along with accepting those referrals. They can't just accept referrals without knowing what to do with them when they've received those referrals. So those were the recommendations based on the environmental scan that we are currently acting upon. And that's our actual presentation. So we have room that we've left for thoughts or questions. I did notice, Neil, there's already one question in the Q&A, but I'd ask other people to drop other questions in there. I'm going to go ahead and read the first question. It's from Marianne Camino, and that one is, as for the children, going back to the unaccompanied minors that are being fostered in families, she says that she has read that undocumented families were also permitted to foster these children. Does this place these children at a higher risk for labor or sex trafficking by any means?
So I can speak to just from one of the things that came out through the literature related to sponsor families. So not necessarily as being licensed through foster parents, but some of the vetting of sponsor relatives and the process of how that determination is made around the I guess you would say the suitability of placement of releasing that child to that sponsor is something that did get highlighted in the research as an area where they did see that some of the sponsor families were in fact then complicit in trafficking that youth through labor after the fact. And so just kind of highlighting that as a potential issue and a potential situation that was identified as something to kind of consider, how do we address some of those situations with when there's so many youth that are coming into care, and that the the shelter process is meant to just be temporary, to be able to appropriately kind of vet the individuals that come forward to say that they want to sponsor this family, to make sure that those youth are not going to be placed at risk of being potentially, trafficked by that caregiver or family member. So I think that's a great question. I'm not as knowledgeable around kind of regulations in foster care, but
I would add to that. I agree with you, Neil, but I would add to that, if you think about even for youth that are not undocumented, or for youth that are at risk in general, family trafficking is a thing, right? Like family trafficking is an issue regardless of whether they are US born or foreign born. There is always a risk for family trafficking, just because of the fact that there are other risk factors, what in public health we call social determinants of health, that are due to socioeconomic status, poverty level, the existence of substances or the needs of the family that may put those youth at risk of their families trafficking them, whether it is sex trafficking or in this case, labor trafficking. I think there's always a risk for family trafficking in these types of situations. So I did see another question, I think it's in the chat, about where it says, do you have any data on where were these minors from? Do you mean the undocumented minors? I'm not sure. So if you can put that in the Q&A, that would be helpful.
Yeah, there's actually all the data from ORR is all publicly available data on their website. If you, even if you just Google search ORR data and statistics, you'll land on their website that actually breaks down the demographic information of the children at a national level and then also at a local level. You could even look at what counties in Maryland have the higher rates of children being released as sponsors. I know Prince George's County, I believe, is the county in Maryland that receives the most number of youth released as sponsors. But yeah, that information is publicly available, and it does break down demographics and looks at country of origin. So again, if you just Google search Office of Refugee Resettlement data and statistics, or unaccompanied children data and statistics, it should land you directly on that page.
Are there any other questions? Oh,
yes.
yes.
Yeah, I do, while we're waiting for people to ask their questions. Thank you so much, Neil and Dr. Nadine. I know that you said that the statistics or the survey results showed the 29% who sell or cultivate or transport drugs as one of the highest. But can you identify for us any other industries, whether it was through that survey or even your research scan? What are other vulnerable industries for child labor?
In general, when we talk about vulnerable industries for child labor trafficking, and it ranges, right? So it could be adolescent-ish too. There are magazine crews, specifically in Maryland. When I think about it, I think about magazine crews, which are youth are asked to sell things in general door to door. It could be magazines, it could be greeting cards. There are youth who are dropped off. They may be even their parents may have even signed them up for things that have, recruited them for skills training, enrichment programs, but really what they're doing is dropping them off in neighborhoods in front of stores where they're selling stuff. And we're not talking about Girl Scout cookies or Boy Scout popcorn. They're selling random things in front of grocery stores. And when they were dropped off, they were told they can't get back in the van and be driven back home until after they've sold a certain amount of things. You have that occurs. You have in some and I'm talking about domestic labor trafficking right now, not even the unaccompanied minors. We do have instances of nail techs and nail salons, although those tend to be slightly older youth from some countries. I'm trying to pull up, I have notes because I actually did a lecture on this earlier this week on specific areas here where we might see that. But yeah, there's a lot of them. There are a lot of different places where we might see youth who are victims of who have experienced trafficking here in Maryland, labor trafficking here in Maryland. Trying to see, I'm trying to remember if there's one, like there's another one that I've forgotten.
No, take your time. I really,
Yeah, like I mean, we also have like the basic, like the farm, the agriculture that we're used to. There's panhandling. Sometimes youth are actually forced to panhandle on the streets. There are rumors here in Baltimore that some of the squeegee kids are actually being forced to be squeegee kids, that it's not voluntary. The back of house workers in your restaurants and hotels, like the dishwashers, cleaning staff, things of that nature, are sometimes underage or just over the age, you know, like we're talking like that 16-year-old after school, but not with working permit youth. So I'm talking domestic, but then sometimes it is our undocumented youth as well in some of these roles, because as Neil mentioned, they might not know the labor laws. They might not know that they should have a work permit to do some of this. They may not know that they're only supposed to work a certain number of hours and then go to school for the rest of the hours. So, and these may be reputable places. And similarly, what I think is going to happen is we learn more and more, and as the word gets out there more and more, similarly to child sex trafficking, where by the time we turned around and recognized what was happening, we also recognized that child sex trafficking was happening from the lowest economic areas all the way up to the most expensive hotels. I think the same thing is going to be seen for labor trafficking. Is once we start to recognize it, we're going to realize that it's happening next door, you know, where a youth is being, that you didn't realize is there, that's been there cleaning up the house of your neighbor that might be an immigrant who's never allowed out of the house. And it might be in that really she hotel downtown. I think that these are the types of things as we learn more, we're going to start to see more about. I do see one more question in the Q&A that's, do you have a written summary of the scan and related reports available? And so for that, we are actually in the process of writing that up. I don't know, Neil, if you want to speak about that, the technical report that we're in the process of writing up.
Yeah, I mean, the report will definitely be finalized by the end of March. That's the end of the grant that funded this project, but we are just kind of waiting. We wanted to update, given that this has been a process that we've taken our time with in order to really be kind of intentional and get as much information as we could. Now that we're into 2023, we're thinking if we can add data from last year, so maybe resurveying those 16 organizations just to get information on the numbers of youth served last year, and then also I'm in the process of getting data from OTIP related to the eligibility letters that were issued during this past year as well. So, and that report will be made available. That we'll certainly share that. So definitely by the end of March. Looks like you're on mute, Renee.
thank you, Neil. I've only been doing this 3 years and have not gotten the hang of the mute or the unmute. So I do have a couple of questions. It looks like it may track then what we see in adult labor trafficking, sort of the same sorts of things. But I do wonder if whether your survey or your scan of the academic articles revealed whether, like adult trafficking survivors, it comes a lot through that labor contractor. And maybe not, because, you know, a lot of them may not be eligible to work pursuant to our Department of Labor, our labor laws. But I'm wondering if you could speak to sort of that third party or that independent contractor, what, if any, does it play into the trafficking of youth? If this question made sense.
Yeah, no, it certainly does. It wasn't something that we found a whole lot of information on. Just kind of given, you know, in terms of like seasonal work visas or things of that sort that are contracted, we didn't find a lot specific to youth that receive those, but you know, I did hear from the colleague that lives in Delaware that just mentioned, you know, some of the susceptibility of maybe younger adolescents to like young adults with the like beach employment that she mentioned, just a concern, like the Delaware Tourism Commission had just, you know, looked into that related to the way that some of those like seasonal work visas are allocated, and you know, those young people that come just for the summers to work, and you know, the shore, like the beach areas, that, you know, is that something that that those youth, you know, could be susceptible for. But in large, we didn't find a lot in the research, and it wasn't something that was captured in the survey that we administered. So but it's definitely something that's I think needs, you know, more attention, and maybe, you know, to try to find out more about that.
Yeah, we definitely are going to look forward to your report. Love to see that. I was also wondering if there's a way we can get hold of perhaps some of the survey questions or some of the screening questions that you have, because I think it may be helpful for us and other task forces as we are trying to develop. There's no point in reinventing the wheel.
So the survey questions, we basically modified the Dr. Fukushima that we referenced her survey questions, which are in the paper, because we also didn't feel we should reinvent the wheel.
Right.
So there's that. But for the screening questions, those are what are being developed right now in collaboration with DHS and DJS. And as soon as those are finalized, yeah, we all across the state of Maryland should start to use them so that we're consistent too, right? We don't want, not only do we not want to reinvent the wheel, but we also want to make sure we're all speaking the same language, because we want to make sure that if DHS is saying that this is labor trafficking, the DJS agrees, and that, you know, the task force in Prince George's County agrees the same way that Baltimore County would. So yes.
Yeah. Great. You're absolutely right. Great point. Let's see if there are any other questions or comments. Okay. All right. Thanking both of you for the presentation. It's been very, very good. Gives us a lot to think about, a lot to, I particularly, and I've been sort of beating this drum as well about looking at that gang facilitated recruit, or that gang recruiting, looking at it through the lens of labor trafficking. So I know we've got some of our law enforcement friends here, so hopefully that will gain traction. Wonderful. We hope that both of you can stay to answer, you know, to further our conversation. We have one presentation this afternoon, but we thank you so much, Dr. Nadine and Neil, for your work and for your presentation. It's been really, really enlightening. We'd like to have you back because we really want to kind of see where we are and what we've learned in the time frame. So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so before we break for lunch, we are going to hear from LaShanta Harris. We are thrilled to have her as our new chair of our Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force. And she is also the new U.S. Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorney in our Greenbelt office for human trafficking. So I think Caitlin is going to try and pull LaShanta in. And we would love to hear greetings and for her to share a little bit about what is happening with our U.S. attorneys and our partnerships. I will not sing while we're waiting.
So I know Detective Lopez mentioned that she had a meeting, so she might be running a little.
Ah, got it. Okay. So if Detective Lopez could maybe give us an ETA, we can figure out.
I think we had told her 1, so I think 1 should be the magic
Yeah.
number.
Okay. Well, let's engage in some conversation through the chat. What did you guys think of that presentation, or maybe share some thoughts of what you've learned from the first half of this conference? Things maybe you're going to look into or employ in your respective work and journey. So let's see what's happening in the chat. Who has something? Great information. Thank you, Jackie. Anything specific that anybody found new? So the beauty of this is that you can eat and share. All right, let's see. What is this chat? It's very hard to, oh yeah, just from a perspective of right, how you process it. Is that what you're saying, Andrea, just listening? Or Andre, sorry. Yeah. I think there's some things that will really help to reinforce at least our practices on the task force and with our partners and how to better engage. Yeah, I took notes, so there's a lot. And Andre, thank you very much for the suggestion of recording. We typically don't, but I think it's good. Right, I agree, Andre. It is necessary, and some of it is hard to hear. We're all on this journey together. And there's a lot that, again, the whole point of this was to learn and engage. While we're waiting for LaShanta to join us,
I did want to provide a brief update. We were
there we
able
go.
to, yeah, we were able to fix our meetings. We apologize about that. We thought with the webinar, we would still have the same features to be able to allow you all to unmute and to show your camera. But we were not able to. So we have created a new meeting. I will keep this open though throughout lunch, just in case people have signed off. I'll keep this one running, but we are going to move over to a different platform just so that you guys can really engage with Jatna and Danielle's presentation. It's very informative. So I will put that in the chat now, just before we go to lunch. And thank you. We also, Nadine listed their resource page as well in the chat for anyone that was interested.
Awesome. And Caitlin, I know you're putting it in the chat, but do you also have the numbers, 884 or whatever?
Yep. So
Oh, there it is. Look at you.
If anyone's, it's 894-2863-8693, and the passcode is today's date. Just so I created this though so that we can use it each day, today and tomorrow. So if you guys are interested in joining tomorrow, use this login. I'll send out a reminder as well. But yeah, it'll be this login will work for both today and tomorrow for the rest of the conference. So thank you guys.
Wonderful. So hopefully, LaShanta, if you can hang on a couple of minutes, we'll wait for LaShanta and then we'll break for lunch and then we'll come back at wonderful. LaShanta is here. So we're going to bring her into this space. And we are thrilled to have her and for her to give us greetings and a brief overview of what our U.S. Attorney partners and what the Maryland Task Force is doing. Thank you, LaShanta.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So sorry for my delay. I was caught in a witness prep, and I was away from my computer, so sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is LaShanta Harris. I am the Human Trafficking Coordinator for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Maryland, and I'm also the chair of the Maryland State Human Trafficking Task Force. And so what I do is I make sure that we continue the communications and the conversations amongst all the partners. And so what that means is making sure that law enforcement, victim services coordinators, legislators, all of our service providers and our prosecutors know that our office is ready and willing and actively working to prosecute these cases. We currently in my office have 28 human trafficking cases. Most of them are located in Baltimore. I'm in Greenbelt, as you can see. A lovely Greenbelt. And so one of the things that has been happening recently is that we did get a really big sentencing in the U.S. Attorney's Office for a person who was convicted of 2 human sex trafficking, child minor trafficking violations. And those 2 cases, that one case, he received 45 years. So that was a huge, huge win. And we were really happy about that. That was out of our Baltimore office. And so some of the things that we're working on active communication and coordination with massage parlors, which is very important. And we're continuing to keep in good relationships with the licensing organizations of the massage parlors. We're trying to get as much information as we can about the activity that's been going on in the state, because as we all know, there's a lot of activity going on that isn't always reflected in the level of prosecution. So we're trying to make sure that the information that we're gathering is up to date and reliable and substantive, and helps us kind of identify the past, because we know what a huge issue this is, specifically for the state of Maryland. So my big thing since I've become a human trafficking coordinator and the chair of the task force is to make sure that the state and our service providers and all of our partners around the state know that we're ready and willing to prosecute these cases on a federal level. I think that's really important. Our U.S. State's Attorney's offices do an amazing job, but we also want to make sure we have the opportunity to get federal charges on people and use our federal law enforcement agencies and some of the technology we have available to have really robust investigations to make sure that when we can get significant time, like the one we just had, the conviction and sentencing we just had, when we can get that amount of time, we want to try to. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that I'm here, and I'll make sure I put my contact information in the chat. And if there's a case that you think our office should look at, let's set up a meeting and you can come in and we can talk about it. I just received a case about 2 weeks ago that we're going to authorize. So the office is ready and willing. And for me personally, a little bit about my background. I initially, when I came out of law school, I was a law clerk, and then I worked at the state's attorney's office in Prince George's County, which is where I met the amazing Renee Battlebrooks, Chair Renee Battlebrooks. And so I spent about 10 years there, and then came to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I spent a few years in labor as well. So what that does is it helps me be able to identify some labor trafficking issues, and because I prosecuted wage violation cases for the Department of Labor, I feel like I have a really strong grasp of what looks like labor violations in places that people might not always pay attention to or see them. A lot of agriculture, a lot of construction work, a lot of kind of seasonal work. And so that background helps me in this position be able to even more thoroughly identify and help agents when trying to develop investigative strategies. So my door/email box is always open. If anyone has any questions at all, if you think we're missing something, if you think we should do more, if you think there's a partner that we're not talking to, I just mentioned I'm talking to a massage therapist licensing group who wants to make sure that they're part of the solution. So if you can think of an industry or a group of people that we haven't been talking to, that we should be talking to, please let me know. Training, we're trying to make sure that we get our school resources officers trained and continue to train them. We've been doing that. Jose's been doing that. But we want to make sure that we know that they have our support and that we're training them about how to identify signs of children that may be trafficked. or may have friends that are being trafficked. So we want to make sure everyone knows to look for signs. So my door is always open. Let me know if you have any suggestions or strategies or ideas that we can consider to make sure that we're all doing the most that we can, especially in my prosecuting office, to eradicate human trafficking.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thank you. I'm definitely going to call you on a labor thing that came up last night. So
I would love that.
outstanding. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for leading, and thank you for the consistent encouragement and willingness to say that you are going to prosecute these. That is huge, and we appreciate that at the local level. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Wonderful. So we are going to take our break now, and we're going to come back at 1:30 to hear our last presentation of the conference. It's going to be anti-racism work in the trafficking field. So we're going to hear from Jatna Gomez and Danielle Bernard. So I can't wait. So thank you, everybody. Eat well, and remember, go to the new login. Because we hope to see everybody in the room, so I don't have to just look at me. So don't make me. So thank you. Eat well, and we'll see you guys in 25 minutes.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, LaShanta.
Bye.
Bye.